And there you go.
Cool.
All right, so Rob DiNuzzo, am I saying that correctly?
You sure are.
Okay, pronouncing the last name correctly.
Yeah.
Well, so we're going to, as we move in here, we're working on a story for you about you that you wrote, but for the upcoming magazine. And so wanted to get you in and talk about it. I know you've got a history with Audi much wider than this. The main focus of this story, I'm going to just share a photo quick, is that tease. I'll pull those up later for people who end up watching the video. Why don't we start first by, I see you have a bit of a history. It's beginning with your dad. So can you tell me a little bit about how we get to this, what I just shared, how you started with Audi and how we got there?
Absolutely. So, you know, I distinctly remember being at the end of high school and my father deciding he wants to buy a nice car. He had always had, you know, American cars, nice cars, but wanted to get something a little bit nicer, certainly something German he had mentioned. So test drove a couple of cars with him and we ended up settling on a 2003 A4. And it was my first time driving, I think it was my first time driving a sedan with four-wheel drive. I had a Jeep Cherokee that I was driving around. So obviously compared with a 92 Cherokee, which had its own positives for sure as a car, you know, just having that feeling of getting in that car. I still remember it, you know, almost 20 years later now. You know, the Quattro and how well it handled, and certainly just how it felt. And, you know, talking about a B6 A4, so this is something where Audi was just really coming into, I think, the mainstream luxury. Obviously, the B5s were really the first venture into that. But with the B6, I think you started seeing a lot more people around driving them, at least of the A4 platform. Yeah. So when I got into that, it was really exciting. And, you know, he would let me drive it from time to time, certainly not as often as I bugged him to do so. But, you know, I always remembered that function. So after I graduated college, when I decided to kind of move on from that Jeep and get into an Audi myself, I found a B5 A4 that I really liked. It's actually in a really rare color called Pelican Blue. Oh, yeah. That they made, and I don't think they even made it past B5. I haven't seen it on any other cars other than a B5 A4.
Yeah, I don't remember the specifics. I remember, like, at that time, I think, was it a 18T, your car?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, there was like a promo that they did where, like, there were some Pelican Blue ones. There was another yellow color. I don't remember exactly. That were like, it was like early out exclusive, right? They weren't really selling. Yeah. I guess if you knew people, but they did this limited run of those cars. That's cool that you had one of those.
Yeah. So it was a really awesome feeling. And, you know, again, that was also my first manual Audi. So, you know, going from an automatic B6 A4 to a manual B5 A4 definitely upped the fun factor quite a bit more. Because, you know, those gearboxes, the automatic gearboxes back then weren't certainly the quick shifters that you see now in Audis and many other brands. So definitely happy to get into that and really enjoyed that. So after I got my first kind of real job after college, which was a couple of years later, you know, I'd always been a fan of convertibles, had friends that had them, family members. I ended up buying a B6 S4 convertible. You know, I had, I think, 40,000 miles on it. It was in, what was the Dolphin Gray was the color. So really nice car. Ended up doing, you know, a JHM tune on it, some exhaust modifications, and really just enjoyed the car. I owned that car from, let's see, it was an 05 car. I think I bought it in early 07. So I had it from 07 until 2 years ago. So I actually had that car for quite a while. Really loved driving it. And again, every time I kind of upped the, I would say, the fun factor of the Audis that I had been driving.
Right.
This one, obviously, with the V8, and, you know, I got scared for a long time of the timing chain issues, and luckily never had them. So
how high did you mileage that one up?
That one got up to 83,000. But I was super religious about oil changing and driving it slowly until the car was at proper temperature and all of that. So hopefully that helped. And certainly what I've heard is the car is still running strong from the buyer for me. So at that point, you know, hadn't had any kids yet. My wife and I were together. And I said, this was 2012 at this point. I had been driving a Grand Cherokee as a daily. And I said, listen, I want to get back in another daily Audi. I wasn't daily driving my S4 convertible. It was down in Virginia, living at the time. So I bought an A3, little 2.0 T, pretty fun little hatchback. Did some modifications to that, and had that car for a couple of years. Unfortunately, for my driving experience function, I had to get rid of that and move into a Land Rover just because we were planning our first child at that point. So the evolution to that point was definitely a really fun time of driving these cars, and really enjoyed, and was really building the brand. And actually backtracking a little bit, interestingly enough, for my master's thesis, I went to SUNY Albany, upstate in New York. I did it on the Audi brand, and as a marketer, on how Audi had adapted between. I really was focusing on the 80s through early 2000s. How it was trying to shift its focus and really start appealing to the younger drivers that might be somewhat turned off by Mercedes and some of the, I'd say, the legacy feelings of a brand. Again, great cars, but certainly don't appeal to many younger people as compared with like even more BMW is definitely aimed at probably the lower end of the spectrum in terms of age. So it was a very interesting evolution, seeing the change in leadership of Audi and especially Audi America, really trying to go after that younger generation. So I had been feeling that all throughout the time as an owner myself. And it was a really awesome time to be driving these cars around. You got a lot of aftermarket support coming around. I'm a big JHM fan, especially for my B6 days. So a lot of really great support for the platforms that were coming out to do some special things afterward, to make them even a little bit more fun. So then after that, this is kind of where I made the decision, like, hey, I want to get into something fun. So I bought a Misano Red B7 RS4, which was actually in the magazine a few years back as a reader's ride. And this is how I met you, George, and Bill as well. Was it 18? I think was the year. It must have been 2018. Down at Waterfest.
Yeah.
We had the booth there, brought some older cars, brought some newer cars. Right. And I really loved that car, just driving it around. I drove it from 65,000 miles all the way up to close to 90,000 miles. So really enjoyed that. Drove it probably 10 months of the year, other than like major snowstorms and salt situations. I live in Westchester County, New York, by the way. So certainly get a chance to use Quattro quite often. So yeah, I had the B7 RS4, really loved that. I'd say the only downside of that car, in my opinion, was the back seat. It was a really small, B7s have really small back seats, especially I'm 6'1". So if I have a kid in one of the seats behind me, they're already cramped. And at the time they were only 1 and 3 years old. So, wanted to get into something a little bit bigger. So I actually went up to Boston and traded in the RS4 for an RS7, which was definitely a step up in performance. But people think I'm crazy when I tell them this, that I actually enjoyed driving the B7 a lot more than the RS7. Because the RS7 is an automatic, and even with an APR stage 1 pushing significant horsepower out of that car, the car does feel very mechanical, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it feels very automatic, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you definitely miss the mechanical nature of a manual transmission, and just the way things were, 14 years ago versus the way things were made. This was a 16 that I bought, so I ended up having that until actually a few weeks ago. And then I actually got back into a B8 S4. I found one manual transmission, black car with the red interior, and it only had 30,000 miles on it. So although it's an 11-year-old car now, it's exactly what I want, because it has a little bit more space. It's certainly got, with an RS7, I felt a little bad driving it in poor road conditions, just because, it's got so much power, and I had summer tires on it, which is another thing. I didn't want to be tooling around New York State in the wintertime on summer tires if I wasn't being very careful. So yeah, that brings me to today. So, in terms of Audis, I'll go back to the auto unions in a moment. I'm at the B8 S4 now, and it's just something about every time you jump in the car, whether it's it's an S model, an A model, or an RS model, you definitely just feel connected to the road. Especially, I would say the sweet spot for me, that the cars that I love the most from Audi are probably the '05 to, to B8 era. Just
Right.
because you do get a lot of that mechanical feel, whether it's of the manual transmission, whether it's, the sport diff in the B8 or a lot of that.
Does your car have, is yours a
Yeah,
sport diff car? To me, that's
yeah,
a great driving car, right? Like
it is.
you can get the manual in it, you kind of get it all, a
Yeah,
little bit of throttle on oversteer.
that's right. That's right.
That's
So,
fantastic.
yeah.
Well,
So,
before we jump, you said something that was interesting to me, that like regarding the generationality, right, of BMW and Mercedes in particular. Right? It's an older demo. Like Audi actually is the youngest demo in the luxury space. I don't know if you knew that. You probably did with the
makes sense though.
Study you did. Yeah. But what's interesting about that, right, is like where you're about to go in the older cars you have now, which are a bit of a departure from an RS7 and a B8 S4, is interesting in as much as there's that classic era of cars, right, like the late 60s, early 70s, that like Mercedes in particular, even BMW isn't quite a player really until the 70s, but Mercedes has these amazing, vehicles that they were selling in that period that like Audi is really still very much on the ropes. In fact, owned by Mercedes at the time, I believe. And
we'll talk about that.
Yeah. But where I'm going with that is like, it's interesting that like part of that generationality is like today, most people, when they think classic Audi, they think 80s rad era or Quattros.
Yep.
Right. There is some history there. It's some really beautiful history, but it's hard to find.
It is. And, it is a very interesting history how auto unions were sold in the United States in the 50s and 60s. But, even, I'll go to a car show with these classic cars, and most people, they see the rings on the back, and some people ask me like, did you just slap that on there? And I said, no, this is actually auto union, which is represented by the 4 rings. And most people only know that, to your point, from the 80s on, right? There's not that much of a brand history here. And, there's definitely reasons for that. They definitely tried to dip their toes in the US market quite a bit. And I think most would call it unsuccessfully, but, very underappreciated car era, I think, for Auto Union and Audi, given that it was owned by Mercedes and it was sold through Studebaker dealerships and it was all this funky stuff going on. Just a lot of people don't know it.
So, should we show your cars before we
sure.
talk? I'd love to. You taught me a bit in reading your story about this, so I'd love to hear about the early distribution too. But like, so you start with this one, right?
That's right. So this is a 58. So this car, again, having been an Audi fan for 20 years at this point, I bought this car in late 2018 on Bring a Trailer, actually. I saw this, and I've always loved classic cars. I've never owned one before this one, and my family's really into classic cars. My uncles are really into them. But
really quick, this is 58 Audi Union 1000. Is the letter?
Auto Union 1000 is the model. Yeah.
Okay, and derived from DKW 3 = 6, which the name nomenclature in that is. What was it, a 3-cylinder, right? 2-stroke.
It was a 3-cylinder motor that DKW, which was one of the Audi or Auto Union brands, put onto its car. That looked very similar to this one. This one's definitely has more the bells and whistles on it than the DKWs did. But 3 = 6 was their reference to 3 cylinders equaling the output of power of a 6-cylinder at that point.
Yeah. Okay, so. Were DKWs? I don't even. I know some are in America now, but like, was DKW sold here and then Audi Union sold here? You mentioned that goes through Packard.
Yeah. Through Studebaker, and and it was it was an interesting, from what I can find, and there are a couple of books written about this, but unfortunately, I also have a 54 Corvette, and trying to look at the history of that car, you could see pretty much every VIN detailed of where it was created and the history very well articulated. With these cars, it's kind of like putting a puzzle together, not only of the individual cars that I own, but of just the models of these cars and how they came to be. But from the research I could do, there were some DKWs that were sold in the United States. I haven't focused most of my research on DKW itself, but there are some if you look around. But DKWs were and remain very popular actually in South America.
Right.
Some for very unfortunate reasons. If you can think after the World War II,
Yeah.
and some people that went to South America.
Some Germans end up there.
Exactly.
But at the same time, there's a rich history down there of like to further development, right? They had like the Monza race car and some others down there, that some concepts, etc. That's a whole other rabbit hole, right? Of like the South American.
That is a rabbit hole to go down for sure. But so post World War II, Auto Union had been broken up, obviously. And in 1949, it was relaunched. I'm reading a little bit of my notes because I haven't memorized all this, but it was relaunched in 49, but only with the DKW brand. So Auto Union, as many listening to this probably know, was really big into racing in the 30s, right? But really kind of disintegrated as World War II broke out in the late 30s and 39. But in the 30s, they had never produced a consumer vehicle themselves, right?
It was the as you mentioned in your story too, it was the collaborate, or it was the General Motors, if you will, right? Like DKW, Wander, Ennis, sorry, not Ennis, he wasn't part of it at that point. DKW, Wander, Hork, and Audi were the brands under these, and then they raced as Auto Union with the with the rings,
the types A through D.
Yeah. And there was even, I don't know if you knew this, there was never made it into prototype phase. There were designs made for like a road going, like the V16 mid-engined car that they were thinking about selling, but it never really got very far. I think there's like a model car of it now of like what the design would have looked like. Pretty rad for like when you think about a pre-war. But all right. So no Auto Union.
I mean,
consumer
no
product.
Auto Union, and then after the war in 49, when Auto Union became a thing again, it was reestablished in Ingolstadt actually, and it became DKW was the only brand that came back from pre-war. So DKW was between 49 and 57, I believe, was the only part of Auto Union that was producing vehicles, right? Auto Union itself, GmbH, was a company again, but they were only producing under the DKW badge until 57, when they took the 3=6 that you talked about before, and they said, hey, we want to badge Auto Union as a more, I would say, focused on upper class version of a DKW to see if they can go up market. And that's this car you're seeing here. So this car is called a Sonderklasse, which is, obviously a designation to, I forget what the exact translation is, but it's I think higher class or something along those lines. I'm sure someone listening knows. But they had 4 or 5 different versions of this car. One was they actually had a cabriolet of this vehicle. They had a 4-door, they had a regular coupe, and then they had this, which was called their pillarless coupe, Coupe Deluxe, as they called it. You can see that the sunroof on this, the rag top, is actually factory. So it came with this massive rag top on it from the factory.
Oh wow! This
was repainted in the 90s when it was in Long Island, New York, before it went out to the West Coast. But these are, from all I can see, the original colors. It was the two-tone black and white. And now I think you have a couple shots of the interior. The houndstooth interior in black and white was redone around the same time. That's the 60. That's the 60 as well. Sorry, so they're probably a little bit mixed up in order here.
Yeah. Let me see if I can find.
Is there not one in there? Oh, there's one right there. Up 39, 6-39. Yeah, that's the interior. You can't see the seats in this one. But yeah, this is the interior of this. So here's the houndstooth pattern on this. So this was redone. Again, I don't have any original pictures of this car, but I'm told this was very similar to what it looked like when it rolled off the floor in 57.
Interesting. Curious, do you know what there's like I don't know what that, something holding an anchor.
So I actually just learned this a few weeks ago. That is the mark of the plant of the what do they call them in Germany? The state of Germany in which the plant was located, or it may even be the coat of arms of the city in which it was built. It's something like that. I'm not sure exactly of what that is. So that's actually what that represents. It's not an Auto Union logo. It's actually a logo of the locale in which the car was built.
That's interesting, right? Because so many like Porsche. The Porsche crest is so much of Stuttgart coat of arms on it. But yeah, that's interesting. Do you know where this was built? Was this built in Neckarsulm?
This one, I believe, I know more about the 60, the SP, which we'll talk about in a moment. I know more about where that one was built.
Yeah.
Again, unfortunately, there was not a history given with this vehicle. So
yeah, and it's a chaotic
very
time.
difficult to piece it together. Yeah.
I will say, I mean, I think between the two of us, we've got a fair amount of nerd knowledge here, but like at the end of the day, this is such a chaotic time after the war. Like Auto Union, when Germany falls after World War II and the Iron Curtain in particular drops into place, all of the Auto Union and assets are behind the Iron Curtain. And so
that's right. Yep.
While BMW and Mercedes and Bavaria are okay, Ingolstadt, as we know it, right, didn't exist. And I think there may have been, was it Neckarsulm? Neckarsulm is, I think, is where the NSU factory was. So like for Auto Union to get started again in the kind of post-war West Germany economy, it was such a it was literally a startup, right? All of the assets,
that's right.
You know, the race cars got stuck in a coal mine, and I guess, you know, what the Russians eventually found them and took them back to Russia. Yeah. But yeah, all that stuff was gone. And so it's interesting to see. There's not a whole lot. I mean, I'm sure Audi Tradition can tell us everything about this, but yeah, it's not really out there widely. So yeah.
Anyway. Actually, so it is the coat of arms of Ingolstadt.
Okay.
I just brought it up on my computer here. Yeah, so it's actually that's what that represents.
So for those,
I'm not sure
listening,
what the anchor is all about, but that the panther or whatever that is, I believe that is from the coat of arms of Ingolstadt.
Interesting.
If not Ingolstadt, then wherever it was built. But I know more about the other one, which we can talk about.
So this car, remind me, this one is a shift on the column, no clutch manual?
That's right. This is called the Saxomat transmission. You know, Mercedes and Volkswagen had similar types of transmissions, you know, back in the 50s and 60s. But this one actually does not have a clutch pedal, but it does have a clutch. And it's engaged when you let your foot off the gas. The clutch engages, allowing you to shift. So it's a 4-speed on the column, with first gear being back and down, second gear being up, third gear being toward the dash and down, fourth gear being up, and then push back and, you know, the reverse. It's a very interesting and quirky transmission to learn. So one thing we also haven't talked about with this car, it is a 2-stroke motor. So
you have to mix, right?
So you don't have to pre-mix it. I guess this was revolutionary at the time because they were marketing it in a lot of the materials that I ended up acquiring, that this had something called a DKW mixer in it. So in the gas tank, there was a mixer. So I usually put, it's a quart of oil. I use Royal Purple oil right now, but a quart of that for every 10 gallons of gas that you put in, and it is a 10-gallon tank. So, you know, you see me at a gas station kind of measuring off and obviously trying to find all the gas stations with non-ethanol gases for the carburetors. But so yeah, you actually have to add the oil first and then put the gas in, which is nice because you don't have to pre-mix it. But the downside is if you don't have a perfect amount in your gas can, you kind of have to eyeball it. But luckily, I've not yet seen any downside to doing it the way I've been doing it for, you know, 2.5 years at this point, a little bit longer than that. So, but point being, so it is a 2-stroke motor. So the downside and the engineering, I mean, you could see the engineering in these cars even back in the 50s. They had to install something called a freewheel. And a freewheeling system is something that ensures the motor still gets lubrication even when you're cruising down a hill, for example. Because if you have your foot off the gas, the car is in neutral essentially. So it would not be providing oil into the through the carburetor into the motor. And because it relies on oil in the gasoline to lubricate the parts, it could starve the engine of oil, which is why it has this thing called freewheeling on it. And it's a little lever under the dashboard you have to pull. I just usually leave it full-time engaged so I don't forget. But this actually allows you the motor to get proper lubrication as it is cruising down a hill or whenever it's driving, you know, without any gas being applied.
Is there a gauge for the oil? Like you mentioned, you have to kind of.
There's not. No.
There's a gauge for the gas?
No tack either. Yeah, there's no tack either. Which it is a 2-stroke, so you can definitely rev it pretty high, but you know, it's not an infinite red line. So you're definitely playing with fire. You know, certainly with this car having 44 horsepower, you know, going up a big hill or something, especially on a highway, which we have one near me here. It can actually be very difficult to get up that hill, especially because if you go to 4th gear, there's not really enough power to maintain speed. And if you remain in third, the revs are super, super high. So it's definitely something that has worried me before while driving it. But this is part of the quirk of driving an old, somewhat obscure vehicle, is you kind of learn the ins and outs, hopefully not the hard way, but you certainly learn them.
Yeah. Oh, and I see it's badge 3 = 6 on the dash.
Yep.
I guess it was still kind of the more like that era's equivalent of like, 20T or, like it was a designator.
And that was actually, I think they were also trying to appeal to some of the people that were familiar with DKW 3 = 6 in the past, not just completely relaunching the car.
Yeah.
But if you compare this side by side, and those listening can certainly do this, to just, DKW 3 = 6, you'll see the appointments of chrome on the outside and the hubcaps. And, they tried to build this much more aesthetically pleasing, and I think charged quite a bit more than they would have for a 3 = 6, for these sorts of up badging, as you may call it nowadays.
That's a beautiful car. Oh, by the way, I looked up Sunder while we're on here. It's in special. I should probably know that, but I didn't.
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So you get this one from.
So I get this one. This one I bought, as I said, on Bring a Trailer. I bought it out of a museum in LA. What's it called? The name will come to me, but I bought it from a museum in LA, not the big one. It'll come to me in a moment, but it had a little bit of work it needed to have done. And so the biggest problem with these cars is not learning to drive them, but as many can assume, finding parts for them, because they never really sold these. And we'll talk about the selling in a moment, but they never really sold a lot of these in the US. So it's not like the Corvette, for example. If I need a new old stock part for that, there's 30 or 40 online resources that you can go to and get them to your door in 3 or 4 days. Right. Now, if something goes wrong on these cars, I have my sources in South Africa, Germany, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and I think and the Netherlands is the final one. So I've bought parts for these cars from all over the world, and it's very interesting because especially with COVID having hit and restrictions on exporting, it got very difficult to find some parts. The worst part for this car to find was the Saxomat clutch, because it is not the same clutch as a 4-speed clutch from this era. And it, from what I could tell, is not a shared part number with Mercedes or any other companies. So I actually had to find a refurbished one from a guy in Germany, and it was not cheap, as you can imagine, but it's something that we ended up finding. And that kind of work is a little bit above my mechanical knowledge. So I work with a local shop here, Briarcliff Classic, here in Westchester County. And, I was able to find an original shop manual for this car, which I think was the saving grace, because, we meaning they were able to reverse engineer how it was set up, and a bunch of new cables were needed. So the car wouldn't really shift. It would stay in first and second when I first purchased it. But to have it be a driving car, which I aim for all of my vehicles, it really needed these parts. So it took me the better part of 8 months to find all of the parts needed to really get this car back on the road. And then things like new tires. This is the paint that I got it with. It's still pretty decent. And then just small things like coil packs. I'll have to send you over a picture of the engine too. A few quirks about this motor. The engine is about 70 pounds. It's just under 1,000 cc's. It sits completely in front of the front axle. The radiator is behind the engine, interestingly enough, and it's got 3 coil packs. So it's 1 coil per cylinder on this vehicle. So I've found things like new old stock cylinders or coils for the cylinders, and just ignition to get it running right. Single Solex 40 downdraft carburetor on it as well. So again, these aren't parts that are really shared with other vehicles. So I would say the biggest challenge of this car has been just finding the parts. 15, 20 years ago, it probably would have been impossible without, online shopping as it is now. So I think it was time for this car to make it back out on the road and really, because it had been in a museum for 10 years. So, just was not running properly.
Looks like that was the Malamute.
Malamute. Yes. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah. Very cool. All right. So you got this one on the road. At what point did you have this one on the road by the time you're looking at the next one?
So I did. Yeah, so this one was pretty much done, and you're never really done with these cars because I'm always looking for like the rubbers for the windows are pretty cracked at this point. So never really done, but it was done to a point where it's drivable. It's relatively reliable at this point. By the way, it gets about 40 miles a gallon. So it's also, I only have to fill them up a couple of times a year at most. So I had been driving it around, and I had been aware of other auto unions, and these are actually the only two models of auto union that were sold in the United States are the 1000 and the 1000 SP. So I had been aware of the 1000 SP, which is this car. And I fell in love with the styling of this, but just to give you an idea, the 1000, it's hard to tell an exact number on this, but many tens of thousands. I'm reading a number here that 100,000 units of these were produced worldwide. This is of the Black 58.
Right.
About 100,000 of those were produced worldwide. I don't know how many of those were imported to the US. I'm assuming only a few thousand, but still a relatively easy car to find parts for across the water and really in other countries. But the SP, they produce, I'm looking, 6,640 SPs
total
worldwide in its entire run. And it was produced from, I think it was 59 through 65. So much rarer car, this was. And I think they produced about 2,000, I'm looking at the number here, something like 2,000 convertibles and roughly 4,000 coupes. So one of 4,000 coupes produced worldwide. And I have not been able to find the number of how many were imported to the United States. I know of two others. One of which is a red convertible that was just actually sold up, I think in the Pacific Northwest. And there's also another white convertible in South Florida somewhere. But I mean, let's assume there's probably 10 to 20 of them sitting somewhere. I don't know how many of them are operational.
Right.
But point being, I fell in love with this car when I saw pictures of it, but I didn't think that I'd have the opportunity to ever purchase one just because, again, they don't come up very often. Right. So this was, just as the pandemic was hitting, actually, back in the spring of 2020, this car popped up on Bring a Trailer as well. This one needed quite a bit more work. It had been sitting in dry storage in Pittsburgh for over 10 years. And the story on that is it was a well-known dealership, an Audi dealership in Pittsburgh, had taken this car in on a trade for an A6. Back in late 2000, like 2008, 2009 or thereabouts.
Right.
So a guy had this car. It was in running condition, but it had a little bit of rust issue. It had certainly a lot of running issues at this point. And the guy who owned the dealership put it into dry storage and kept it there for 10 years in Pittsburgh. And then they decided to list it on Bring a Trailer. I saw it, and the second I saw it, I said, I don't care what this gets up to, I'm buying it. So luckily enough, I was the winning bidder on that, got it a few weeks later and really dug into this one. This one, the interior was falling apart. It needed a complete overhaul of the motor and transmission. It had quite a bit of bodywork issues. Now, it was all original body, no repairs had been done, but there was gas stains underneath the gas cap. There was, dents here and there. So this one required a lot more work. But certainly worth it, I think, for what it turned out to be. So I had the interior redone, the motors completely revamped with new old stock parts that I could find. Challenging, the clutch wasn't as hard on this one. This one's a 4-speed on the column with a clutch pedal. The toughest part to find on this one, I needed a completely new exhaust system, including everything. It has an expansion chamber to muffler to rear exit. I had to find this. This was a reproduction part that was made in Germany, probably 20 years ago. And I was actually able to find it and at not a low expense, get it shipped here to the United States. Not. But I mean, the old one was rusted out and it sounded like a race car, which was funny for a 3-cylinder motor because there was just so many rust holes in that. But yeah, I mean, we did paint work, completely redid the paint and the body, made sure everything was smooth. And here it is driving today.
So curious, was it Sewickley Audi?
It was, yeah.
So that dealership in Pittsburgh has a great history of being, they built the first 20 valve Quattro in the US. The owner had like a whiter Quattro that he did a 20 valve swap into. I think they built the second one. I remember seeing those at like Pittsburgh Vintage Grand Prix back in like 89, or sorry, not 89, back in 1999 when the anniversary was happening. They have a great history of like being into the old cars and being weird, like
Yeah.
not they're not weird, but into the weird old stuff that's like
Right,
pretty nerdy.
cars. Yeah.
Yeah, where some dealers will just be like, whatever, lease the latest A4, Q5 or whatever, move it on its way. And Swickley was this dealership in Pittsburgh that really dug into the brand and into, it doesn't surprise me then that they were the ones who had it, right? That they would take this as a trade and be into that, or that it would sit in their warehouse. Because I heard they had a flood at one point where they had to get rid of a bunch of the inventory they had, but they had like a bunch of just old parts storage and, you know, still probably 80s stuff when you talk about old cars, right? Not this, but well, probably. All right, so maybe if you could, I'm curious what you know. What's always struck me about these cars is there's a period of Audi production that these cars are in, and there are a couple others that that you could cite, but like this one in particular, very obviously inspired by the design of the Ford Thunderbird.
Yeah, the 57 Thunderbird for sure. And there's actually, I think Haggerty wrote about this, and I think Bring a Trailer did a spot about this as well. That it was not a shameful rip. Like they admitted, like, hey, we want to bring up the design of American cars that had been so successful. Because again, if you think about it, this is Auto Union. They designed this car in 57 and 58 to launch in 59. They saw the success of these cars coming up, and, coming out of the US. And obviously the 57 Thunderbird is one of the most iconic designed rear ends of all time, and certainly still recognizable. And from all I can read about this, no one ever denied that they were ripping that off. And if you look at the front, I mean, the front could definitely be, there's some design cues taken from Aston Martin. There's, I've gotten a lot of different asks like, hey, is this in some sort of quirky Aston Martin? Especially with the hood scoop and the front grille being what it is. And obviously, Aston Martin's, DBs would come out after this, especially, the DB5, which a lot of people mistaken the front end of this for, came out after this car. But it's very interesting that Auto Union was clearly trying to make a space for itself in the United States and really the North American market. I say North American because this car was sold in Canada new. So everything's in kilometers, and it was sold in Ontario, brand new. So I think what really did them in is they were relying on what had been popular in Europe at the time, which were fuel efficient kind of small motors, which you see in many European cars of this era and before. And the styling, while very striking, could not make up for that in the United States. Because, I mean, they were competing against, GMs that were really coming out with the V8s, and Fords that were, had been producing V8s for a long time. And when you put up next to that a 3-cylinder motor putting out 54 or 44 horsepower, it's very tough to justify to a market that is used to 130 to 180 horsepower engines around this time, at least. Even though these cars only weigh about 2,000 pounds each, just the performance was not there to back up, especially the looks of the SP. So the interesting note is, if I bring up, I'm just looking at my little cheat sheet here on this. Auto Union was actually sold to Daimler, and Daimler-Benz in 58, which is when the black car came out, acquired a majority stake in Auto Union. And if you'll remember, Auto Union was only producing DKW at that point. So when Daimler was in talks, from what I've read, when Auto Union was in talks to sell to Daimler a majority stake, Daimler was the catalyst that said, hey, we want to get these cars over to a new market. And that new market obviously was North America. So, and Daimler-Benz at the time was not a huge company in the United States either. They actually had, and we talked about Studebaker dealers earlier, they actually had to sign an agreement to market their cars through Studebaker Packard Corp dealerships through 64, I believe it was. So even,
Audi
some of the
specifically, or Daimler too, because wasn't Mercedes with Max Hoffman?
I'm not sure, because I've seen pictures, and I can upload them into this drive of, you have a dealership, Studebaker, Auto Union, Mercedes-Benz.
Interesting.
But from what I've read, I'm pretty sure about this, that Auto Unions were only sold through Studebaker Packard dealerships at that time.
Maybe so, right? Like I'm another, and I'm at the edge of my knowledge, so I'm going to try and sound like an expert in this. But like one of the fascinating people to me in American automotive history is Max Hoffman, right? That
Sure. Yeah.
he's the guy behind the 356 Speedster. I think he was the behind the Gullwing too, or at least its success in the U.S. And so like I'm curious if so many European brands came through him, and he's of course a patron to like culturally too, right? A patron to Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright does his Mercedes dealership on Park Avenue, which I think was really designed as a Jag dealer, which I think Max was also probably behind their early history in the US too. So yeah, I'm curious how, I guess anybody coming into the US, whether it would have been Mercedes or here with the Auto Union brand, would have been like looking for distribution. And so anybody, Packard, sorry, I keep saying Packard, Studebaker having distribution in the US and having dealerships and probably looking for more product to cluster in, they probably hooked up in various ways. But
that's absolutely correct. And it's a very interesting, because when VW actually purchased Auto Union, from what I've read, it's around 1964, and Daimler, from what I'm reading, actually bought their way out of the agreement in 64.
Okay.
Auto Union was scrapped. When Volkswagen acquired Auto Union in 64, they actually kept, it's interesting, Horch, which was the super high end of Auto Union.
Right.
Daimler-Benz retained the Horch brand, and the rest of the Auto Union brands and Auto Union itself were sold to Volkswagen.
I saw that in your story too, and I'm curious where that did they eventually sell it to Audi? I
didn't look beyond that, because I would love to own a Horch, but there's only a few of them, and they are crazy high in value.
Right.
But I'm not sure what Daimler ended up doing with the brand after that.
Well, I know like Audi, how like Mercedes has the Maybach stuff, right? Like now it's sort of more a package level, I guess, if you will, on the highest end Mercedes.
Yeah, on the S6,
Right. And now Audi has they're doing a Horch version of the A8 for the Chinese market, at least, where they love big, long, luxurious cars. But like, so I assume then Audi now has rights to that brand. But yeah, I'm curious how that was
it'd be interesting
to
follow up on that. I'm honestly, I stopped my research on them on Horch at that point when I just thought it was an interesting tidbit that Volkswagen agreed to buy all of Auto Union, but Daimler wanted to hold on to Horch. I mean, obviously, it aligned with its.
I would bet it was a competitive thing. Like here for me in town, it was I was looking at a building years ago. We were doing Vortex, and there's an old Minus building, right? And that had like 7 bays and like lifts and all this cool stuff. Like, I don't know, it seemed like a great boondoggle. And I looked into it, and it was deed restricted, right? Like it was deed restricted because it had been bought by a garage nearby, and the garage didn't want the Midas to be competition in the future, so they deed restricted it so they couldn't. And I wonder if Mercedes wasn't maybe thinking some of the same thing, like, we don't want Horch coming back, we don't want the competition in the German luxury market, so like they would just. I'm curious. The other thing I was going to say, the T-Bird reference on the SP, there are some other cars that if you look, you can't kind of unsee it. I love one of my favorite cars of that era, a little later I guess in this, is the NSU Prince. What it would be the 4, right? The NSU TT and TTS. That the TTS in particular, or the TT with its dual round headlights, is basically a mini Corvair. Like if you look at the style, like the proportions are a little different, the size is totally different, but like the detail work, it's totally Corvair. But I think more elegant than a Corvair. Okay, so I'm curious though with your SP, have you ever had it next to an equivalent era T-Bird that like, I think it's much smaller. I've never seen them next to each other.
It's definitely smaller than a T-Bird. I mean, it is a deceptively tiny vehicle. There is a back seat, as you showed in some of the pictures, but I mean, you can't fit a human being back there. I mean, it's basically just a seat pad on a flat bench. So it's a very small vehicle. I mean, you can't really tell because there's no point of reference on this shot, but it's quite a small vehicle. I have not had it yet next to a 57 Thunderbird. It'd be an interesting shot. Completely different look, or maybe not completely different. There's definitely some styling cues on the front end as well, but obviously it's the fins and the tail that do it.
I'll tell you, right? That's as we were kind of going through the photos earlier, while you were talking, like when I look at the thing as a whole, like I'll just go to that shot for people who might be looking at this when we were on the YouTube version. it immediately says to me T-Bird, but then I start looking at the details and like, okay, the greenhouse is different, and that almost looks more like the 3 = 6 or the regular 1000, or maybe even like a long 356. But then you get down to the grill or the, you know, here the with the fins or the grill itself, and when I look at the pieces, I don't see T-Bird as obviously, right? Like it's like the whole thing is like, I get the nod, but like it's interesting. It's a lot more complex than I kind of get, just, you know, when you start considering the details of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's a really awesome car to look at, because it's got, I think, so many cues from, like, it's almost like a Frankenstein car, right? Because it has so many details from others. And, you know, some people see, and even if you look back at the 58, a lot of people, when they see that, they think Renault or something, you know, something else European, that, you know, or Bug even. I mean, you look at the headlights. I mean, there's clearly styling cues from Auto Union, because they were not really, you know, they produced cars for 8 years, and these were the 2 models that they produced and sent to the US market. They clearly took a lot of styling cues, but it wasn't just rebranding of something, especially with the SP. It is its own standalone vehicle, which is what drew me to it. But it's just so many subtleties to it that make it cool, like the functioning hood scoop. I mean, that you don't really need, when the motor is so close to the front grille, you don't necessarily need that fresh air coming in the hood scoop, but it is functional. It actually does open up into the engine compartment.
No, is the radiator behind the engine in that one too?
It is, yeah.
So maybe the scoop is more direct to the radiator?
Well, I mean, being built in Germany at the time, I mean, these cars, I mean, were not designed for warm weather. I would not take either of these out on a hot day here, you know, just because of their cooling capabilities. But they do have fresh air intakes on them, right? So, you know, if you want to have air blowing into the cabin, you know, if the windows are closed, you know, they do suck the air in, and there is a heater on both of them as well. It doesn't really work all that well, but I'm also not going to be driving it when it's super cold out. So, I mean, it's interesting. I'll have to upload a picture of the engines, because, you know, you can see, I think a lot of people joke around that Audi over-engineers certain things, and probably is not alone with its German counterparts in doing so. But it's very interesting to see, like, the idea of coils, right? I mean, and the ignition system on these cars. Just so interesting to see, and especially having one coil per cylinder is very uncommon. I mean, a lot of older American cars had a single coil. And certainly the old Volkswagens had single coils, and Porsches had single coils. Why did they do one coil per cylinder? I mean, they just had a lot of very interesting quirks about them that make them very interesting to sit down and look over, and certainly to work on as well.
And so this one is a column mounted manual, but it has a clutch, right?
It does. This one has a clutch pedal.
But it has the mixer of the 1000. So
it has the same, it's the same gas tank. Yeah. So it has the same functionality within the gas. It's the same carburetor as well. It's a Solex 40 downdraft.
Is it effectively the same chassis, just a different body on the same chassis? Do you know?
I have to imagine it is. I haven't dug that deeply into them. I mean, happily, I haven't had to really get down. Both of them were rust free, which, by the way, the fact that this is a Canadian car and also lived in Pittsburgh, the fact that it's rust free, I mean, someone took care of it for a very long time. This car has 65,000 kilometers on it. So this car was driven. I mean, you know, it's not a garage car its whole life, which is super crazy that, again, this thing isn't rusted to bits, you know, again, Canada and Western Pennsylvania.
Well, yeah, Pittsburgh, though, has great car culture. And there was a lot of, like, I don't know if it was just the steel industry or whatever, but like there was, whether it's, you know, back then with the dealers that were there, or today with the Pittsburgh Vintage Grand Prix, like it's certainly got its, you know, I don't know if have you ever spent time in Pittsburgh? There's like
just driving through museum. Yeah.
There's like I think it's the Frick Museum. There's like a museum there that's got, they even like had some, they were trying to sell stainless steel. And so they sent stainless steel to was it Ford? And if they made several stainless steel, there was actually a stainless steel T-Bird, right? Like in the museum where like all the body work is done in stainless, but they were trying to get the automotive companies to think of stainless as an option for production because no rust, right? But like,
yeah, I actually have with this car came a couple of dash plaques from that they call it Vintage Grand Prix. Yeah, so cool. This car was a show car for a while. and was definitely brought around. So that's great news for me, because I mean, with both of these, although there's a downside to keeping it in dry storage or keeping it in a museum, you know, both were protected from the elements, which I have to imagine a lot of both of these models over the years have just lost their way to rust. Every now and then, you know, I'm part of the DKW Auto Union groups online. You know, you'll see a really rusted out one of these cars come up, and it's sadly beyond repair. I mean, like the frames are rotted, and you know, you might be able to salvage a couple parts here and there, but you know, it just makes it, I think, that much more of a challenge to find the right parts and keep them in, but also makes you appreciate, you know, the former owners, you know, having taken such good care of these cars. I mean, these aren't crazy high dollar value cars. And I think part of that is that a lot of people don't know they exist, and Auto Union as a thing did not persist, right? I mean, Auto Union went away, and really, I mean, a lot of car enthusiasts that are not Audi enthusiasts don't even know what Auto Union is, right? They know the ring logo from Audi, but they don't know what that represents, nor the history behind Auto Union, which is very interesting. And I'd say you get the next level of people knowing about the 30s Type A through Ds and, you know, the racing legacy of Auto Union, but never realizing that Auto Union actually produced vehicles under that badge for 7 or 8 years. So it's definitely it's always a very interesting conversation with people, especially, you know, if you get, you know, a newer Audi fan, you know, guys with R8s, you know, they're like, is that an Audi? And, you know, it opens up a really interesting conversation about, you know, the history of the brand, which, you know, when we were talking about doing this article, I think just a lot of people are not aware of. Again, I think most people that listen or read very aware of the racing legacy of Auto Union, but probably don't know a lot about, you know, its time actually selling vehicles under this moniker in the US.
For sure. Well, so what is that what drew you to, you'd already deep dive into Audi, you'd had several, is that what drew you to buying these early obscure, you know, models, because nobody's gonna have another one?
Yeah, you know, that's right. I mean, part of it was timing too. You know, we had just bought our house and it had a few garage spaces, so I could actually get more vehicles and work on them here. But yeah, I mean, part of it is always, I've always had a love for classic cars, but the one knock against it is oftentimes you'll go to a classic car show and there'll be 10 or 15 or 20 of the exact same model. One of them had air conditioning, one of them had, you know, factory radio, and one did not. Like, the very small differences. But what brings up really awesome just recognition and just conversation, more importantly, is something that people haven't seen before. And, you know, being the way that the car market is nowadays, and pretty much everything selling like crazy and at crazy high values, and you know, the auto auctions being more of I'd say a global event than they ever have been. Sure. We were just in Scottsdale a few weeks ago, actually, and you know, people are still there wearing all of the shirts from the auctions. It's just become such a big thing that people are aware now a lot more of these obscure cars than they ever have been in the past. You know, they'll watch them go across, and oftentimes with obscurity, you get obscure brands that people have never heard of. But it's interesting because these are actually the foundations of a current brand that most people are not aware of. So it's fun to drive. I think part of the fun in it is actually that the parts are not readily built. So it's part of, you know, it's almost like building I have two boys, 5 and 3. It's almost like building a Lego set for which you found an old set of instructions in German, and that you have to go all over the world to find, you know, different specific blocks to be able to finish the build on it. So it's part of the fun, I would say, of this, is that you can't just go online, order all the parts you need and get them installed. It's like you actually have to learn quite a bit of it. You have to learn who to go to, and you have to build relationships with people, many of whom don't speak English. So it's overall a very fun time, from the research to the build to the display and the conversations afterward. It kind of all comes together into a really interesting hobby.
Interesting. The experience is as much the network and
absolutely
the challenge of it than just calling up the
and again, it baffles my mind that especially the SP with the really awesome design that it has just is not in more people's minds. But again, you're talking about a car that had 6,600 units produced in its entirety, you know, over 60 years ago. I mean, you could start to see why a lot of people just aren't aware of it. So driving down the road, people will just say, "What the heck is that?" And it's really fun just to kind of bring something out that people haven't seen before.
Yeah, I bet. Well, so all right, where would people see? I know we're running out of time, and you've been generous enough to give me part of your afternoon here. It is as do you take the cars out much, and if you do, where might they catch you? Either local Cars and Coffee or shows you like to go to, or
Yeah. So there's a Westchester Cars and Coffee that I kind of rotate the cars, which one I drive from time to time. That's up here in northern Westchester County, just north of New York City. I'll bring it to some shows, mostly classic shows in the area. We have a place up in the Adirondacks. So you and I were talking, we'll probably bring it up to the Auto Museum at some point this summer. So just try to, where I don't want to go is I like driving it. I don't like trailering cars. I'll probably trailer them up to Saratoga because that's 150 miles, 120 miles away. But
that one may get moved, by the way. There was a scheduling conflict with NEQ. Yeah. So I'll keep you up to date on that. But yeah,
I typically drive them within a 20 to 25 mile radius of here, just again, with something breaking and you not just be able to go to the corner store and pick up a part for it. Yeah. I do get a little bit worried anything beyond that distance, but yeah, Westchester County, New York, I'll bring them to shows around here, and hopefully I can get out to some of the, with COVID, fingers crossed, going away, and more shows coming back in a larger capacity. Hopefully I can bring them up trailer wise to some of the shows in the Northeast.
Well, I look forward to seeing them out there, man.
Yeah, you're headed to Amelia, right?
I am. Yeah, I leave tomorrow morning. So I'm driving. Howard Hughes in me is like, why don't we drive instead of flying? So like, I'm just gonna get in the RS6 and hit the I-95 south.
There's worse things to drive down in an RS6.
The only thing I'm worried about, I love the drive, but the miles. Yeah, the miles are what scare the hell out of me. But I'm gonna go visit a friend in Virginia on the way down, and it should be an excellent trip. They've got Radwood going. They've got. Have you ever done Amelia?
I haven't. No, it's something that I've always wanted to do. Yeah.
It's a great time of year to get away to the south. So like there's that. But yeah, I find it's like a little bit more intimate and a little more eclectic than like Monterey or some of the others. No, I mean Haggerty owns that. They own what's the one in Connecticut as well that they just got.
The Greenwich Concours.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how the game changes on site, because I know they really raised the game for Greenwich. I heard they've integrated. Just funny quick story. So I was selling my Jeep Wrangler that I had a few weeks back, and I met a guy named Will, who's one of the regional VPs at Haggerty, and he came by and he saw the SP sitting in my garage, and he's like, "Hey, bring this down to Greenwich." So to your previous point, I probably am. I think it's the weekend of June 5th is going to be the Greenwich Concours. So I likely will have the SP down at Greenwich for that one if people want to stop by and see it. Hopefully we'll see you there then. I didn't realize that if that's in June, we'll try and get that on our calendar too.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, that was another fun thing too, just trying to get that insured with Haggerty, and they were great about it, but they don't have auto listed in their that's database. Yeah. We just think to deal, I think we're finalizing it now between Audi Club and Haggerty to try and get more awareness. Going back to the generation thing, just to call back to the earlier conversation, is like they have very few Audi owners in their space, largely because very few Audi unions or NSUs or DKWs were sold in period. And really until, the cars aren't that robust from like the first C1s and B1s to like the Quattro era, right? And like of the Quattro era, cars are Quattro, driven hard, put away wet, rusted. So even clean 4000s are pretty rare. So Quattros are about it. There aren't a lot of those. But we're seeing like the Radwood era stuff, like there are a lot more people up to like, even B5s are starting to come into that front end of that classic situation, right? That's crazy to think, isn't it?
Yeah, we're getting older. Well, like I'll speak for me. Maybe you're not, but I'm getting old. So like, but yeah, it's nice to see, and it's nice to see so many people our age getting into the hobby and picking up these cars from this era and showing appreciation for them. And as the values go up, I know a lot of the people who like the deals over years are like, it's too expensive to own an Quattro now. But no, but like the values make it possible to do the restorations. So I'm not necessarily against it. Well, I'd love to have a ton of cheaper Quattros. I'd rather see like the well-preserved ones. So
that's right. Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see. And I mean, hopefully, more people can save these cars, whether they're the Quattros that are rusted out, whether they're the old auto unions, just, because I think they just sit and rust even more, especially if they're in, the northern part of the country. And it's unfortunate because it's a very important piece of Audi's brand history that's unfortunately just most people don't get to see very much.
Totally. Well, God love you for both buying them and getting them on the road and keeping them on the road. It's great to see. So
thanks, George. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your time.
Awesome. Thanks for the time.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye.